joining us this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Virginia Moore, Vice President by Ginny. Hopefully many of you had time to interact with her today. She started her academic career getting her bachelor's degree from McGill University in environmental science. She went from McGill straight to the University of Wisconsin, where she completed both her master's degree and her PhD. Her master's was in agroecology with a minor in related ag econ, and her PhD then was in plant breeding. She did 2 postdocs, one at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the second with USDA ARF in Beltsville. She is now an assistant professor at Cornell, where she started in February of 2021. So just celebrated her first year. And she's a member of the plant breeding department with the School of Integrated Plant Science there at Cornell. Welcome, Ginny.
Okay, great. Can people hear me?
Yep.
And hopefully people can hear me on Zoom too. I see there's some people there. And yeah, thank you so much for hosting me. It's been such a pleasure to meet you all today. And I haven't had that many opportunities to actually interact face to face with other scientists since I started at Cornell. And yeah, it's been really a pleasure today to meet you. And so before I get started on the topic of my talk, which is plant breeding for sustainable cropping systems, I will give you a little bit more of a sense of who I am. Becca gave a nice overview of my academic trajectory, but yes, as she mentioned, I started out in agroecology and ag econ, and maybe a little bit of an untraditional background for a plant breeder, but I think it really fed into my interest in plant breeding, and that my research had been on cover crop adoption and technology adoption in general. So I'm really interested in how plant breeding can be used as to incentivize use of sustainable practices in general. And my PhD work was focused on organic systems, breeding for organic systems, and my postdoc was focused on cover crop breeding. And so I've been integrating plant breeding and sustainable cropping systems in one way or another for a while. And today I'll center my talk on 2 case studies within plant breeding for sustainable cropping systems. I'll focus most of my time on cover crop breeding, which has been the work I was doing in my postdoc and I've continued to do as a faculty member. And then I'll also talk a bit about a new project that I'm working on developing dual purpose perennial grain and forage systems. But before I dive into the case studies, I'll talk a little bit about the general idea of breeding for sustainable cropping systems, what it means to me, how I'm thinking about it. And so, yeah, I guess when people talk about sustainability, we often hear about the 3-legged stool, right, of environmental, economic, and social sustainability. And in terms of plant breeding and cropping systems, we might be thinking about what traits can promote ecosystem services that we care about, like soil health, water quality, biodiversity, etc. And in general, I guess I think about enhancing crops to provide more of these ecosystem services, or about making it easier for farmers to adopt sustainable practices rather than so either a focus on the ecosystem services or about the agronomic management that allows those practices to be adopted. And I've mostly focused on the latter, although I'm very interested in the former as well. And but maybe the lowest hanging fruit are targeting the agronomic traits that enhance adoption first. We also think somewhat about economic sustainability in my program. Things like diversifying farm incomes through adoption of new crops for a given region, or thinking about resilient local food systems and So my program thinks about and works on these to some extent. I do work on hemp and perennial grains, which are new crops for New York State. And then social sustainability, this could look like a lot of different things. We might be thinking about culturally appropriate foods or breeding crops to promote healthy diets or health and quality of life for farmers and farm workers. And I think of the three aspects of sustainability, we really haven't touched this one at all, although it's something I care about and think about a lot. And I'd be interested to hear ideas from this group too about what that could look like. And I'll talk about it a little bit at the end if we have time, particularly about how we can think about ideas of equity in plant breeding. But so to focus on cover crops first, for some context, so farmers are planting cover crops for this wide range of ecosystem services, environmental benefits related to soil, water, and nutrient and weed management. According to the 2017 Ag Census, there were 15.4 million acres planted to cover crops in 2017. And that represents a 50% increase in acreage since the 2012 census, which is an impressive and rapid expansion. But before we get too excited, that's only less than 4% of the total cropland acreage in the US. So certainly we see increasing use of cover crops, which is great, but there's a long way to go if we see them as one of these solutions for addressing environmental problems in agriculture. And farmers talk about a number of agronomic challenges that limit their ability to integrate cover crops on their farms and in their rotations. So cover crops have this much higher degree of management complexity compared to a lot of other management strategies that they're using on their farms. And there's been a lot of really great agronomic research, including in your department, about how to optimize things like seeding rates and seeding and termination dates, for example. But we also know that farmers are largely not planting cover crop varieties that are specifically adapted to their regions. And that's because there just aren't very many cover crop varieties available, and there's not much happening in the way of breeding in the cover crop space, at least compared to cash crop crops. And so back in 2015, a group of breeders and agronomists conducted this national survey of farmers to determine the need for cover crop breeding. And by and large, farmers supported the idea of increasing investment in breeding and variety improvement for cover crops. And many also indicated that they would be willing to grow more cover crops if they had better adapted varieties. And some even indicated that they would pay more for cover crops if they provided more benefit. So it seems like there's demand for cover crop improvement if we can find the investment to make that happen. And so this was part of the impetus for the founding of the Cover Crop Breeding Network, which again started in around 2015. It was first funded by the Organic Research and Extension Initiative, which is a USDA grant program. And so the network started in 2015. I got involved in 2019 when I joined my postdoc at ARS in Maryland. And I've continued involvement in this network and am now serving as a PI on the recent iteration of the grant. And the network has really expanded. We started out at a few locations for breeding and a few more for variety trials. And now you can see we have, so all of the red dots are breeding locations at research stations. And the blue diamonds are on-farm breeding locations. So we have this network of farmer collaborators making selections on farms. And we also have advanced line trial locations, which are some are at universities or ARS research centers. We also collaborate pretty closely with the USDA NRCS plant material centers. So those are, I think, around 25 regional centers that have kind of a mandate to work with plants that promote conservation broadly, and they, including work on cover crops, they also do a lot of work with native plants and other conservation oriented plant research. So they run advanced breeding line trials for us at some of those locations. And then we also, as of this fall, are working with a group called Seedlinked, which runs coordinated on-farm variety trials that are using basically a design where each farm plants a single replication of maybe only 3 or 4 varieties. So it's a pretty low ask for farmers in terms of the space and time that they're committing to participating in a trial, but we can get, dozens or hundreds of locations. I think we're targeting 30 for our first year working with them, but it's another way basically for us to get cover crops planted in more locations. And we're particularly interested in working with this group for winter hardiness testing because, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but it's really challenging to breed for winter hardiness when we have really unpredictable winter weather conditions. We never know if we're gonna see complete death or complete survival and whether we'll have a useful year for evaluation and selection. So these are the cover crop species that we're working on. So we have done most of our breeding in winter annual legumes, so crimson clover, hairy vetch, and winter pea. So we plant these cover crops in the fall after cash crop harvest, and then terminate them before planting in the next spring. And we're breeding these winter annual legumes for a few different traits. That kind of high priority ones are early vigor, winter survival, biomass production. At some sites, we prioritize early or late flowering. There's a few other traits that are kind of species specific. We also recently started doing work in cereal rye. We had planted our first nurseries this year, and we also have done in the past some trials in brassicas, but haven't done any breeding in brassicas so far. And so these are the core traits of interest that I'm going to talk about today. There's other important ones too, but I'll highlight these for the purposes of the talk today. So the first one is establishment and early vigor. And in terms of, so early vigor is important for us in terms of getting plants that will get up and out of the ground and start to compete with weeds in the fields, and also will put on some growth and be able to survive the winter in a lot of our northern locations. And we select in a pretty basic way, perhaps we identify the smallest plants in the field and give them a rating of 1, and then the largest plants are 9. And we do all these visual ratings for vigor, both in fall and spring at all of our locations. And we then, we've seen at our more southern locations, for example, in North Carolina and Maryland, that there's high correlation between fall and spring vigor. But at our northern locations, we see a trade-off that the most vigorous plants in the fall have a penalty when it comes to spring vigor. So we need to balance kind of our fall vigor is important for us in terms of weed competitive ability, and but spring vigor is also highly correlated with final biomass production. So we're thinking about both of those traits in our breeding program, and using a selection index that balances the two for our selection nurseries. And in addition to selecting vigorous plants that establish quickly in the field, we also in my lab, I'm looking at interseeding as a potential establishment strategy for cover crops. So interseeding allows cover crops to get established before the cash crop is harvested. So they have a chance earlier in the season to get established, and the idea being that they'll then have a improved chance of success to make it through the winter, and also to put on enough biomass in the spring to offer the ecosystem services that we're interested in. And so that's the theory. We find in reality that interseeding is kind of challenging, that we have these cover crops that they get planted, and you can see in this picture on the left, so the interseeding happens usually between, we target between vegetative growth stage 3 and 7, if you're talking about corn, and similar kind of early growth stage in soybeans or other crops as well. So the idea is that the crops can get established before canopy closes, but then they have to make it through the growing season in these kind of shaded conditions. They're also competing for other resources like water and nutrients with the cash crop. And in my experience, the system works maybe 1 out of every 3 times that I try it. Maybe I haven't optimized the system on our research farm, but I've heard similar things from other folks working in these systems too. And so if we get in early enough, and they can establish early enough, then they make it through the season, and it does often perform better than cover crops that are drilled at the end of the growing season. But there's also potentially some cover crop species that are more tolerant of shade or other stresses that happen in the interseeding system. And so we were interested in my postdoc. I analyzed this data set to look at the interaction between planting method and cover crop variety or mixture, to see if we could kind of figure out the optimum system for which species. And this trial took place between 2013 and 2016 in Maryland. And we used these 3 planting methods of drill interseeding, which happens mid-June at this early growth stage. We also tried broadcast interseeding in late August, and then post-harvest drilling at the end of the growing season. We tried it with these 4 species or mixtures. And so this is the kind of the timeline of the project. You can see kind of when each of the planting methods happen. And we found, like many other interseeding studies, I would say that the performance is fairly unpredictable. We saw interactions with the weather and the planting conditions, and really only saw interseeding outperforming drilling in 1 of the 3 years that it wasn't better than post-harvest drilling, when we had a warm, wet fall that gave time for the drilled cover crops to establish. And they also didn't perform particularly well when interseeding happened on the later end of that V4 or V3 to V7 window. So the cover crops were established too late, it didn't work very well. But we did see some interactions with species also. We know that from other studies that there's some species like red clover, annual ryegrass that often work better in the interseeding systems, more tolerant of shading or other stressors. But there's really very little variety level data. So as a plant breeder, I've been interested to see, can we see variety differences in tolerance of interseeding, and can we select for improved performance in these systems, so we can kind of improve our ability to establish cover crops early in the season. And so we established this trial. We don't have data yet, but we established this red clover interseeding variety trial this summer. We had 11 cover crop or red clover varieties, and we established them towards the end of that optimal window at V6. And we saw some visual differences earlier in the summer, but by fall we saw some senescence and no significant differences in biomass. But we'll be interested to see if any differences emerge in spring biomass, and whether any of the varieties that are currently on the market perform better in interseeding or not. And then I am also planning to do some selection in this trial, so selecting the plants that have survived so far through the season and doing some crossing and selection to start developing varieties that work better in these systems. And yeah, so in addition to establishment and early vigor, we also care a lot about winter survival. It's probably the most important trait for our northern producers. Again, because these are all fall established cover crops, and if the cover crops can't make it through the winter, they're not providing the ecosystem services we're hoping that they will, and farmers are not going to waste their money on seed to plant them. And so for winter survival, as I mentioned, we've been doing some on-farm breeding, and that's been a really successful strategy. Some of our most winter hardy varieties were selected on farms either in North Dakota, Iowa, or Wisconsin, where we've had really harsh conditions. And the Lisa Kissing-Kusik is the face you see at the corner. She's a research scientist at USDA ARS, the Dairy Forage Research Center, which is in Madison, Wisconsin. And she's really coordinated all of the on-farm breeding work that the network has done so far. And yeah, so we've seen in multiple trials that selecting for winter hardiness is challenging. This is a crimson clover trial that we planted over 3 years, and really only in 1 year did we have meaningful winter kill where we could make where we could differentiate between lines. And the same thing is true in our advanced breeding line trial. So this is data analyzed by Lais Bastos Martins, who's a grad student at NC State that I work with closely on this project. And you can see that these are winter survival data from all of our pea breeding, our pea advanced line trials. And you can see only a few of the sites actually have variation for survival. Most of them have either complete survival or near complete death. And yeah, so we deal with this basically by planting more locations, especially in northern environments. And then we also have done increasing amounts of work using controlled environment evaluation for freezing tolerance. And this isn't perfect, it doesn't mimic conditions in the field very closely, but we do our best to use these cold acclimation and deacclimation protocols to mimic what happens in the fall and spring, and then subject the plants to extreme freezing temperatures and look at both survival and with traits that are associated with survival under these conditions. And most of this work has been done by Nick Wearing, who was a graduate student and postdoc with our group, and then now there's another postdoc in Minnesota has carried on this work. And I have a graduate student that's also interested in getting into this work, and we're in the process of buying a growth chamber that can let us do these kind of extreme cold temperature studies, which is very exciting. And yeah, and then I guess the last approach I would say that we've used to look at winter survival is kind of a combination of looking at genetics and cropping system factors to understand how things like planting date and whether it's planted in a monoculture or in a mixture with a companion grass, how those features of a cropping system might affect the ability of the peas to survive. So with winter peas in particular, so many of the other cover crop species, we already know that earlier planting increases winter survival and biomass production in the spring, but with peas, we've heard more anecdotally from some farmers that actually late planting is better. And I think this in part depends on how people are planting the peas. We actually plant our trials all now at a depth of about 4 inches. The peas are getting planted pretty deep so that they have more growth nodes below the soil surface and can regrow if their above ground tissue is killed over the winter. And so the idea is that later planting, the peas are expending less energy growing a bunch of tissue above ground and can recover more easily in the spring. And so we're doing this trial looking at 4 different pea varieties at 4 different planting dates, with and without a triticale companion grass. And so we're pretty excited about this trial. We're planting it at New York is actually the warmest location at which we're planting it. But we're also planting in Minnesota, Montana, and North Dakota, which are all colder than we are. So we'll see kind of how the latitudinal gradient also affects all of this. So it'll be pretty interesting. I've been out in the field since we had like a little warm spell and saw some pretty big differences in winter kill, and we'll see. I think we still will get some regrowth, and so we'll see what actually emerges. But yeah, I think it'll be pretty interesting. And yeah, and then so the third trait that we care a lot about is biomass production in cover crops. This is one of the most important traits because biomass is generally thought to be a driver in the ecosystem services the cover crops can provide, especially related to soil quality and soil health. And we're kind of in the midst of analyzing all of our biomass data for publication. We have 3 years of variety trials for the 3 legume species we're working on at about 15 locations. So it's kind of a massive amount of data. And so I can't share kind of the full results yet, but I do have some early data from the hairy vetch breeding program. And we're really interested, particularly because the cover crop seed market is quite small compared to a lot of cash crops. We're interested in identifying varieties that are really stable across locations, that are producing high biomass across the country or large swaths of it at least. And so far we've seen some success. I would say we have 2 kind of contrasting years. In 2019, we had a pretty cold winter at a lot of the sites that we were trialing in, and we saw these kind of latitudinal gradients emerge where a Minnesota bred line was the top performer at a lot of our northern locations, and then a Wisconsin line was the top performer in these mid-latitude locations, and then a Maryland line was the top performer in the south. And I would say also of note that even though these lines were the top performers in these regions, we didn't see, we saw all of our breeding lines, or many of our breeding lines, outperforming all of the Czech varieties, all of the commercially available material at all of the locations. So for example, you can see that in these mid-latitude locations, the top ranked Czech variety was Purple Bounty, and it was ranked 7th after all breeding lines ahead of that. So we have made pretty enormous progress over only a few years. I think that's really just reflects that the hairy vetch has had pretty minimal breeding effort, so it's not so hard to overcome the currently available varieties. So I think we're excited to release materials. I think we have some pretty good stuff in the pipeline. So this is the 2019, the cold year. And then in this warmer year of 2020, we saw a pretty different pattern. Basically, this one breeding line out of North Carolina was the top performer almost at all of our sites. And we saw, I don't have the map for it, but 2021 was very similar. It's the same North Carolina breeding line performed best everywhere. And so this is like our candidate for variety release. So we're hoping that will happen in the next year or so. It also is a pretty good seed yielder, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's pretty important for the seed companies that would think about releasing this line. So we're pretty excited that hairy vetch breeding material will be making it to farms in the near future. And okay, so then seed yield is the last trait for cover crops that I wanted to talk about. And so seed yield is really important because seed cost is a pretty critical limiting factor for farmers adopting cover crops, especially for legumes. The seed tends to be a lot more expensive than than rye, which is the most common cover crop planted across the country. And so a lot of farmers just plant rye because it's cheap and it will dependably survive almost everywhere. And yeah, whereas the legumes cost more and are less consistent in surviving the winter and producing significant biomass for the subsequent crops. And so we focused on seed yield in the cover crops that we're breeding. And a lot of that work is happening with our collaborators at the USDA ARS Forage Seed and Cereal Unit, which is in Corvallis, Oregon. So in the Willamette Valley, where a lot of seed is produced in general in this country, and certainly a lot of cover crop seed as well. And their kind of preliminary results show that our breeding lines are producing competitively, if not better, than a lot of commercially available hairy vetch, which is great. And I think another, yeah, you can see the second from the top line is the North Carolina line that produced the most biomass across sites. So it's more justification for releasing that line, which is very exciting. And then, yeah, but then I would say that the big challenge with hairy vetch for seed production is this seed pest vetch bruchid, which is really ubiquitous across the country. And we found that it's a major limitation both in our breeding program and also for seed production in general. So if you're not spraying regularly for this pest while pods are on the plant, then we can get up to 90% loss in our nurseries for 90% loss of seed. So this is limited also the ability for seed producers to produce seed organically. And considering how important cover crops are in organic systems, this is a big challenge. And there's been almost no work on this pest in general. We don't know very much about its biology. Basically, what we know is based on relatives that affect other legume crops like lentils and peas and fava bean. And so and we certainly haven't seen any breeding effort to increase resistance to the insect. And that there has been some resistance identified in these other legumes. So you know, there may be resistance in vetch as well, but we just don't know anything about it yet. So this past fall, I planted a trial looking at a bunch of USDA germplasm in hairy vetch to look for resistance, and we'll see what happens. We also are developing some greenhouse screening methods to make it our system more efficient and less dependent on natural infestations. But again, it's pretty ubiquitous, so we expect that we'll be able to screen for it in the field as well. So more on that in the future for sure. And then crimson clover is the other crop that we've really focused on seed yield for, and we found this a lot more challenging. Our breeding material is not competitive with commercial cultivar seed yields, and we are not totally sure why. And so we're working again with Ryan Hayes from the Forage Seed and Cereal Research Unit to focus on crimson clover seed yield and doing a pathway analysis to understand why seed yield is different in our material compared to commercially available lines. But it's kind of put a damper on some of our crimson clover breeding work because we can't produce seed on it effectively. And yeah, and I'll just give a little teaser about a couple of other traits that we care about, but haven't done as much work on so far. So the first is allelopathy. So this is something that we're starting to work on in cereal rye, and so far the work has been led by a graduate student, Shannon Cox, who's at North Carolina State University, and she did some field screening for allelopathy in rye. Basically, the goal here, so allelopathy is the chemical mechanism of suppressing weed germination and growth. So the plants produce these allele chemicals, and so we've done some screening either with natural weed populations, but that can be pretty challenging if we don't have a uniform weed seed bank across the field. And then we've also experimented with using lettuce as an indicator species. So we overseed lettuce in the field and look at lettuce growth around the plants. And you can see in these pictures, hopefully, that you know there's significantly less lettuce growth around these rye plants. But again, it's a little bit subjective if the lettuce seeding isn't really uniform. It's a little hard to be certain about whether you're really seeing allelopathy or just some natural variation. So we brought a weed scientist on board, Ramon Leon Gonzalez, who's also at North Carolina State University, and he's been working with a postdoc to develop some lab screenings, which we hadn't gone that route before because they're also not super correlated with performance in the field, but we've seen good results in terms of filtering out completely non-allelopathic material, so we can at least screen in the lab ahead of time so we can have more efficient selection when we get into the field. So we'll see where that goes. That's all fairly preliminary with the new grant that we got this fall. So again, more to come on this. And then forage quality is also a really important trait, especially for producers that might want to include cover crops as kind of an emergency forage and have some diversification of their crop and income streams, right? And so we've looked at forage quality in our advanced breeding lines and seen big differences on a species basis, not as big of differences on a variety basis, except that we've seen that our later maturing breeding lines have much better forage quality across a number of traits. Crude protein here, we also see the same thing in total digestible nutrients and in vitro dry matter digestibility. So that's the key forage quality indicators. In general, we see pretty high, well, in some of these qualities, we see higher forage quality in hairy vetch than leader pea and some vice versa, but in general, they both have performed better than crimson clover for forage quality. And yeah, and then mixtures was the last general topic that I just like to mention as an area that we're interested in going into. So cover crops are very often planted in mixtures, and legumes often planted in mixtures with grasses, which are typically more competitive than the legumes. And so we haven't bred explicitly for performance in mixtures so far. We do often, so our breeding nurseries are planted on an individual plant basis, and so we usually plant a turf grass as a weed suppression measure just for management of our nurseries. And so there's some thinking that these turf grasses would provide analogous competition as planting with, for example, rye or triticale, one of the cereal grasses. But we haven't tested that explicitly, and we do also plant our advanced breeding line trials with companion rows of triticale, again to potentially mimic performance in mixtures. But I'm really interested to actually explicitly test whether our material is better adapted to mixtures than other material, and to start selecting explicitly for performance in mixture systems, since that's the way most farmers are using them. So that's the snapshot of what we're doing in cover crop breeding. And so the other system that I want to talk about more briefly is developing perennial grains for sustainable cropping systems and integrating those with forages, dual purpose system. So perennial grains have been kind of this hot topic in the last few years. Intermediate wheatgrass, or kernza, has been promoted as a tool for sustainable cropping systems, developing grain crops that don't require the same level of tillage as annual crops. And there's certainly interest in these crops, but there's also been a lot of challenges agronomically to get these systems to work and to be profitable for farmers. One of the big challenges is that we see a drop off in grain yields after the first year. And we found that that's largely due to nitrogen. The crop needs quite a lot of nitrogen to maintain yield over time. And so, concerns about applying a lot of synthetic nitrogen and kind of reducing the overall environmental benefit of these crops has led to interest in developing these intercropping systems with legumes so that they can receive some of their nitrogen from nitrogen fixation. And there's also the added benefit of using the forage as a secondary output. The intermediate wheatgrass doesn't have a lot of it, or it doesn't have super high forage quality on its own, but when intercropped with a legume, the forage quality is improved and is certainly adequate for at least some livestock systems. And so we recently got this grant from the Alfalfa and Forage Research Program of USDA to study these dual purpose forage and perennial grain systems. And I'm working with a group of both agronomists and plant breeders to look at these two goals of developing nutrient management recommendations and selecting alfalfa for performance in these intercropping systems. So the first study focused on nutrient management. So we're doing a nitrogen rate study in alfalfa and Perennial systems, looking at different treatments of fertilization rates and looking at different varieties of alfalfa with different dormancy ratings. The idea there is to start to look at which varieties, at which levels of dormancy might be better suited to the system. The main challenge is that in some of the locations where we're planting, the alfalfa tends to outcompete the intermediate wheatgrass, and so the thought is that alfalfa with lower dormancy ratings would be less competitive and allow the intermediate wheatgrass to be more dominant and produce more grain. And then so we have this trial looking at the N rates and the varieties, and then planting them both as mixtures and monocultures. And the trial was planted this fall in 4 locations in Kansas, Minnesota, New York, and Wisconsin. And so the first data will be collected starting this summer. So again, stay tuned. And then on the breeding side, this is sort of fed into some ideas about breeding for mixtures in general. And this is a figure from a paper that actually just got published yesterday that we've been working on for the last year or so, reviewing methods that plant breeders can use to breed for intercropping systems. And so thinking about kind of what defining the problem space, what are the cropping systems that we're breeding for, and the problems that we're trying to solve with these cropping systems, and assessing whether there's genetic variation in the species within the cropping systems for performance in these systems, and thinking about whether selecting for them in monoculture is sufficient. Can we observe the traits that drive performance in intercropping without actually breeding in intercropping systems? And kind of the overarching question is really because plant breeding is expensive, and if we're trying to breed for multiple species or variety combinations, it gets pretty expensive and unwieldy fast. So trying to understand the extent to which we can do these selections in monocultures or compared to more limited numbers of combinations of different varieties. And anyway, so in the context of the alfalfa and intermediate wheatgrass cropping system, basically we're selecting alfalfa in these intercropping systems. And the first stage of the project happened, but we made some selections in a trial that had already been planted, and we're doing seed increase now to plant the next cycle of selection and to do more selection in the next year. or to plant the next trial the next year to do more selection. So that piece of the trial is again to come, but is pretty exciting, I think, and will allow us to explore some of these ideas about the optimal ways to select in these intercropping and sustainable systems. So I'll leave the case studies there, and I just wanted to mention briefly before I close this, coming back to this, the third leg of the stool, I'm thinking about social sustainability and moving towards equitable plant breeding. So this is, something that I think about a lot, but haven't put into action in my own breeding program yet. But I've been thinking about, especially with some colleagues at Cornell, and published, or we've submitted a paper that's up on preprints right now, called Towards Equitable Public Sector Plant Breeding in the US. If it's a topic that's of interest to you, I would recommend checking it out. I think it brings up some important questions in plant breeding and in general, how to think about equity in plant science research. It's, but basically thinking about how to make the process of plant breeding equitable by, for example, engaging with stakeholders that whose needs might not ordinarily be considered in plant breeding, and thinking about equity in our training of grad students and postdocs, and how we having equitable hiring practices as well, but then also thinking about what traits, what outcomes in terms of the varieties we develop, what would that look like to be equitable, and that could be things like prioritizing health and wellness in communities, and prioritizing equitable distribution of benefits of plant breeding. So, do the communities that developed the domesticated crops actually receive royalties from the crops that came from their communities, things like that. And yeah, so these are kind of big ideas that I'm still grappling with how to implement in my own program, but I think it's important that we talk about them as scientists and plant breeders. So yeah, I would welcome conversation about that. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there. I'll acknowledge my collaborators and funders and lab members. But yeah, thank you so much.
Great, we've got some time for questions.
Yeah.
Why do you use lettuce to check for the allelopathy?
Great question. Yeah, we chose lettuce. I think I wasn't around at the beginning of that project when they were actually doing that decision making, but my understanding is that they chose it because it germinates pretty quickly and reliably, and I think compared to other things they tried, it was also like more sensitive to the allelochemicals. As yeah, we saw it as kind of this optimal, like good germinator, but sensitive plant. I guess that there's a lot of kind of unknowns with that system, though, whether lettuce is susceptible to the same allelochemicals that the weed species are, and yeah, a lot of things we don't have answers to, and I think it was kind of a best solution in the moment that we could manage to implement on a field scale. But again, it's been a challenge to figure out the field evaluation for that trait, and so I think in the end it'll end up being a combination of the lab and field screening, but we'll see. A fun adventure. Yeah.
Did you measure the percentages of hard seed in the seed yield varieties? And I know that makes a large difference whether it comes up for a cover crop right away when people plant it.
Yeah. So we measure hard seed before planting all of our varieties, just for seeding rates, but we also in hairy vetch, and crimson clover, we've been evaluating hard seed in all of our lines for selection purposes too. So in Crimson, some of our sites select for soft seed and other ones select for hard seed, actually for pasture, self-seeding purposes. But most of the sites want soft seed so that the cover crops don't become weedy. And that's been, I would say, the biggest barrier for hairy vetch adoption for a lot of farmers. They're just scared of it becoming a weed. And so that's been, we have a whole separate grant focused on hard seed and shatter and hairy vetch to reduce weediness, and been developing markers and selecting on both of those traits, and have some candidate lines that are better for both of those. So yeah, thanks, good question. Yeah.
First, thank you for the frontier study and the nice presentation. I have a question, because I'm not a field scientist. I just curious, when you perform the, the evaluations of breathing tolerance, controlled evaluations, you change the air temperature. So how about other factors? Because I'm thinking that in reality, the tolerance, the breathing tolerance capability may be influenced by soil physical conditions and the soil carbon. I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and we're certainly, the growth chamber work leaves out a lot, and we hope that it will help us make some progress for genes that influence freezing tolerance, but it isn't taking all the factors into account. So I don't think we'll ever get away from having lots of field environments to evaluate those traits, because we just don't know enough about all the different factors. I mean, we know, for example, that ice sheeting is huge at some of our sites. If we have ice sheets on parts of our field, we have a lot more winter kill. And I don't know that we have a good way in the growth chamber to evaluate that. And for sure soil conditions too. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Earlier in the presentation, you were talking about vigor, early vigor, and I think showing some relationships between vigor and cover crop biomass. I was wondering, how did you define vigor and how did you measure it?
Yeah, so that's measured. It's a subjective rating scale from 1 to 9, and kind of breeder's eye, I guess, is the best way to describe it. So we're looking for plants that visually have the most biomass and are look biggest and happiest. It's a very subjective way of measuring it. We have done some early work on imaging with mostly with ground operated imaging platforms, like on like push carts or tractor mounted, especially because in our breeding nurseries, we're looking at individual plants and they're typically planted in turf, and it's hard to differentiate from a drone the plants from the other plants in the field. So that's been kind of limited, and so we've been looking at imaging as a way to make the measuring vigor a little bit more objective, but it's a method that a lot of forage breeders have been using for a long time, just these subjective ratings, and I've seen papers showing that it's pretty well correlated with more objective measures of vigor, destructive sampling kind of measurements. So it's a quick and dirty way to get it done and collect the data. I think we've been fairly successful in improving vigor in our population, so works for now. Yeah, thanks.
Aaron, we'll go Aaron first, and then we'll.
Oh, okay, sorry. So would fall vigor be correlated, do you think, with or could you select for those plants and maybe start planting them earlier, or later in the fall?
Yeah, I don't think we know that yet, and it's something I'm really interested in looking at multiple planting dates in our nurseries for rye, especially. I've heard a lot of farmers asking for rye that they can plant later and we'll put on more biomass. when planted late, but yeah, we have, short answer is no, we haven't looked at that. It seems like it could be related, but also if they're growing at lower temperatures, maybe we don't know how correlated it would be at different temperatures. Yeah.
So early in your presentation, you spoke about the environmental sustainability, and you had on the screen, you had water quality. So do you have in your research network colleagues who look into that? I imagine there's a huge potential and benefit that we haven't even become sufficiently aware of.
Yeah.
With these cover crops and longer covering of the land surface, it has great potential for rain characteristics that are really threatening. No-till doesn't do the job anymore. So with living biomass, the land surface, there's a huge potential. And if there are people in your network, so I would be interested, how do they approach water quality? At what scale do they do that?
Yeah, we don't have any collaborators in the network focused on that yet, but I do think it would be super valuable. Really, the only more ecosystem service measurements that we have taken in our program, and we have measured biological nitrogen fixation in some of our trials. Like worked with Lori Drinkwater, who's also at Perennial, on that work. But yeah, I think we're always limited by like the number of plants and plots and the size of plots often to be able to say meaningful things about, or certainly we can test in our advanced breeding line trials after the fact what the impacts are, but selecting for those traits in our nurseries is a little bit harder often. Yeah, but I get lots of questions from farmers about BNF and about some of these other ecosystem services, and do we know about roots? And the short answer is no. Like we've really looked at only the low-hanging fruit agronomic traits so far, but I think as this area develops more, it's definitely a priority to me to look at what's happening below ground, and I think it's a great idea to look at water quality specifically. Thank you.
Could you talk more about how you developed your ideas around equity in plant breeding? And just like maybe some of the history about, has anybody considered that? Is there like a history of active exclusion?
Yeah, so yeah, I guess the conversation around equity, I mean, some of it started, when a lot of the conversations about equity started in the last couple of years with George Floyd's murder. And yeah, but it's something that certainly that's a very active conversation at Cornell, and a lot of that is driven by grad students. I think they're doing a lot of the DEI work in our department, which I think is true in a lot of places. But again, the paper was led by a postdoc in the department, and also co-authored by several grad students. And yeah, and I guess I've had some of those conversations in other plant breeding spaces to some extent. I don't think it's happening very broadly in the discipline, at least in like at conferences that I've been at, not enough. And I do think there's active, or that there's a history of there's a really good paper actually, I think by Steve Jones about eugenics courses being taught at land-grant universities for a long time, and a lot of plant breeders being involved in the eugenics movement when that was big in the US. And so I think there's a long history of racism in the field of plant breeding. And I think that it's really, I think across agricultural science we're not inclusive enough and not serving all of the potential audiences, right? So yeah, I think it's a tough conversation, but I think it's important to to have as a community of scientists, because I think we'll be better if we're including more people in doing the science and who the science is serving both. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about it more, but I can leave it there for now.
I'll put a plug in that the postdoc can lead off on that paper is going to be interviewing with us on April 20th and 21st. So keep that question in your pocket. We'll bring it out later again. Have we got one more for Ginny, or are we feeling like we're good today?
Are there any in the Zoom chat?
Oh, good question. Can we pull that up?
Oh, there is one. Let me see. There's my notes. Okay.
There you go.
Great, I see. The equity issue is interesting. How do you define community when it comes to contribution to breeding a crop, and who would advocate for their ownership interests? So that's a great question. And I don't think I have all of the great answers. I think the place where I've seen this come up the most is with indigenous communities in North America, you know, with wild rice breeding or corn breeding, and you know, that there has been advocacy of the tribes to get some remuneration or credit or have some say in how the breeding happens or if the breeding happens. But I don't think we have systems in place right now that make that happen on its own, except that like we have international treaties that the US hasn't signed about fair compensation for countries who are the originators of germplasm. But again, yeah, the US hasn't signed those treaties, so that's not happening here. But yeah, and that also is complicated and has made germplasm exchange more complicated and difficult among countries. So it's, yeah, it's definitely a complicated issue, but I think, yeah, we're talking about it and figuring out if we can.